So today we're going to talk about government corruption. And experts estimate that government at various levels uh, wastes probably 2 to 5% on uh, public dollars lost to waste or fraud or abuse. And we tend to overestimate as members of the public how much corruption is actually going on in American politics. So we tend to think that our government is more corrupt in a lot of ways than it actually is, especially when it comes to the influence of interest groups and lobbyists. We common thought is kind of just, oh, your lobbyists show up with money and their bags of money buy votes, and the connections between money and votes with your public officials and decisions in administration are less clear. Certainly, this is not to say there's no government corruption, but the connections are less clear when it comes to the role of interest groups and lobbying than we like to think. So, uh, overall crime rates are down, but white collar crime, the kind of crime you get from corruption in public administration, is actually up, even though overall crime rates are down. So we tend to overestimate how much corruption there is in our government. Nonetheless, it is still higher than it has been in the past, based on documented evidence. So let's talk about what corruption is. So corruption is the abuse of power. It's the abuse of power, of your position. It's a violation of the public trust. It's often for personal gain by an individual or an institution in the public or private sector, but certainly we're focusing on the public sector in this discussion. So there are different types of corruption: bribery, nepotism, misappropriation of funds, kickbacks, extortion, spoils, and conflict of interest. Uh, Conflict of interest is especially one that in local governments you're often trying as a public administrator to avoid what appears to be a conflict of interest, at least, because um, a lot of these local public administrators are in small towns, and so there's this visual of conflict of interest because everybody in town knows each other. So if you operate in a small town and your city council is made up of business people in the small town, and and when it comes to contracting services, you end up contracting with businesses in the town, and there's not a whole lot of options because you're in a small town. So it looks like the city manager is contracting with a local business, and oh, what's going on there? But actually, that would make sense because there's a there's an interest on both sides, and they're supporting the community. Sometimes these small towns have a lot of people who are related, so you end up contracting with a group uh, that you're related to the owner of that business or something. So there's a lot of oh, well, now we can't contract with that company because so and so is my brother-in-law. So then you have to contract with somebody else because you're avoiding what looks like a conflict of interest. And yes, could definitely be in the worst circumstances a conflict of interest. So that is particularly one that's in small town politics important to avoid conflict of interest, because it's easy to fall into a situation where it looks like you're doing favors for people who you have a vested interest in succeeding. Um, Bribery oftentimes is something that we think about with like the police. So police, dirty cops taking bribes in drug cases or whatever it may be. Um, Small towns also deal with nepotism. So if you're in a small government administration, you deal with nepotism where uh, uh, because you have positions to fill and you have family that could fill them, you fill them with family, and so you have to be uh, uh, aware of the optics of those kinds of things. This is one of the reasons why public employees are hired through a merit system, and these jobs have to be posted for a certain amount of time. They have to be public, and people in the public need to be able to apply for them because we don't want to return to the spoils system where people who are elected to office then hire administrators who fill all of the positions in government and all of the bureaucratic positions with party loyal and candidate loyal people. To the victor go the spoils, as they say. So, obviously, then there's the other ones I mentioned: misappropriation of funds. There's a fine line between incompetence and misappropriation of funds. So, certainly, someone can charge that you've made a misappropriation of funds, uh, uh, but perhaps you're just an incompetent administrator who didn't know what they were doing. Kind of depends on the circumstances. Uh, some of the ways when we talk about corruption and we talk about uh, kickbacks and white collar crime and extortion and um, some of the ways that people rationalize this. So there are organizational issues. When we talk about organizational ethics, we try to figure out how do we make an organization that is ethical, that has an ethical mission, where people are not getting sucked into some kind of group think where they're doing unethical things because of the mission of the organization. But when individuals get caught doing unethical things, we tend to rationalize it through several techniques. So first, you'll see when you and some of you may see this when you examine a specific case of public administration ethics. So um, you know the use of interrogation tactics in Guantanamo Bay or uh, the sex scandal at Penn State. If you look at the people in those cases and how they rationalize what they do, there's a lot of different rationalization techniques when it comes to corrupt, unethical behavior. One being appeal to a higher authority. So if you're appealing to a higher authority, that's kind of along the lines of I was following orders. Um, so I had to do this for the person up the chain. Remember, bureaucracy is very hierarchical. So the people that are performing the unethical acts are sometimes following orders from people above them to do so. So they'll say, "Look, I was just doing this because I was instructed by my boss to do that." Denial of injury, obviously, in the extreme cases, like interrogation techniques like Guantanamo Bay, this would be a tough one to justify. But people often do unethical things and then deny that there's an injury to anybody. So a public administrator gets caught with a prostitute, and they might say, "Look, no one's hurt. This is just an exchange. I'm giving them money. They are giving me sex." And this is just an exchange of goods. There's nobody injured in this exchange, as immoral as it may be. So they might deny injury. Denial of victim is another defense mechanism, another rationalization technique that people use when they commit unethical acts in public administration. So they will say, well, those people. The attitude is kind of like, well, those people deserved it. They're not really a victim. They were complicit in this. Uh, social waiting. Social waiting is another tactic. So you catch criticism. Um, you catch criticism from groups or maybe the news media, and the defense mechanism, the defense technique might be, you have no right to criticize. So you don't have a right. You don't have any higher standing than I do. You don't have a right to criticize what I did. You've done worse. So you see people justify their unethical behavior like that. Uh, Denial of responsibility kind of goes along with appealing to a higher authority. Some people will just deny that they're responsible for what happened, for the unethical behavior in question. Denial of illegality. This is a common one in public service. So just because something is legal doesn't make it right. Just because something is legal doesn't make it ethical. But a lot of times, like when we were talking about amoral administration, immoral administration, and moral administration, a lot of times people will go to legality. Well, they get questioned about something a decision they've made as an administrator, or something that they have done, and they say, well, this is legal. We're allowed to do this, and that will be how they justify, rationalize the potentially unethical behavior by saying, well, it's not illegal, so it must be okay. We didn't break any laws. That's some kind of rationalization. And then lastly, metaphor of ledger. So metaphor of ledger is where you put yourself at a you feel like you've earned it. We've earned the right to do whatever this is. We've paid our dues. We've earned the right to carry out this act, no matter how questionable it might be. And so you see those things. You see those things used as a way that people in general, but in this scope, public administrators justify some of their unethical behavior and some of their corruption. One thing that is kind of a rule of thumb as a public administrator, to kind of a guide to kind of go by when you're making a decision, and in order to make ethical decisions, and not find yourself in a situation where you're using one of these rationalization techniques, is to ask yourself. It's called the front page test. So it's to ask yourself, as the public administrator making the decision, would I be willing to have the actions that I'm taking now make it on the front page of the local newspaper? And if you're hesitant, or if you don't think you would want whatever you're doing on the front page of the newspaper, then you may be making a decision that is against the public interest and is ethically questionable. And so in your future careers, keep that in mind when you're making decisions. All right, that's all I have for this video lecture. Thank you.